city, from what we've discovered, is you have that legal right to choose if you want this to be communities that exist in your city. So again, it's legislative in nature, in that this is up to the council.
And you further in that memo, it says under Idaho code, and you understand the Idaho code governs us, right? It says under Idaho code, establishing an RV as a tiny home on wheel can be achieved by following strict regulation standards, but getting a tiny home on wheels to sit in a permanent location is near impossible. So we've got a pretty clear message that we need this thing to be permanent, and to get a tiny home on wheels to be considered permanent is counterintuitive to that, right?
Sure. And so I think we aren't proposing they be permanent. We're proposing they stay on wheels. So for example, City of Moscow, they allow tiny homes on wheels. The route that they took to do that was they're actually allowing you to apply for an RV park. So like, let's say you have a property, you can apply to have an RV park, but then you can just have a 1-unit RV park. And so you apply, you go through the process. They say, yep, you can have an RV park. And then you can bring in your RVIA certified tiny home and put it on that property. And because they've removed the time limits for RVs to stay, they basically say, as long as it's movable, still an RV, and you can have it there.
And so what we've seen from the state side is the state saying, well, this is just LUPA, is cities, you're going to govern yourselves essentially through some mechanism of changing your code. You have the legal right to change your code. And if you choose to adopt this new code, state of Idaho won't come down and say, you have no authority to do that. They won't supersede the city unless, if the city adopts its code and it has the right to do so.
Well, and I think to add to that, I mean, the state, obviously, if you did something completely against state law, they would come down on you. But I think what's happened is the actual city's interpretation of so Idaho law basically says, hey, RVs are only for, recreational use, emergency use, or temporary use. Okay. But the state doesn't really go into details about what that means effectively. And so the way cities have dealt with this, like temporary use, the cities have simply put a limit of time on how long RVs can stay. But that's not the only solution to say something is movable and temporary at this location. The other solution, which is what Moscow did, is say, you just keeping the wheels on, and if we ask you to move it tomorrow, you can move it. And so it's clearly temporary because it can be moved, but we're not actually going to tell you to move it. Right? So as long as it stays movable, that's the actual solution that Moscow came up with to allow them, while still saying, hey, we don't need you to actually move it every 3 months to prove to us that it's movable, because we really don't want to regulate that, go out and see that you moved it 2 feet over to say that it's movable.
In your research, how transient is the mobile home on wheels community?
Mobile home or tiny house on wheels?
I'm sorry, tiny house.
So in the few communities I've actually visited, again, they're pretty permanent. Like I said, the truth is here, if you start to go even around the valley here, if you look at RV parks, they're basically permanent except for the regulations that force them to move. And so right now we're in kind of an emergency in that, like literally, I think the Idaho Statesman has several articles about people living in RVs and they can't even find places to place those RVs right now. So there's certainly a need for people to have a permanent place to put them. And I think the real question is, would you guys be willing to look at that and go, we can do what Moscow did and just say, look, as long as it's on wheels and it can be moved, we consider that something that's movable and temporary, even if it's not being moved every 3 months, like the code currently requires for RVs. I think the other solution is just to give a longer time frame. Like even if you said, look, you do have to move it off once every 5 years.
Sure.
That way, in 5 years, we make sure they are still up to date and movable. Then even that's a long enough time frame where you kind of create a community where somebody would then move it off and make sure that it is still mobile and that they're actually still able to roll. Because I think there is that fear that if you have these homes just sitting there and never moving, that there may come a time when they can't be moved, right? I mean, that's kind of what happens with trailers.
I'm going to have to intercede here. We've got another work session topic. You have, I'm not sure we're through with this discussion. You have a couple items or one item on the agenda later on. Yep. If you would like to continue this for a few more minutes, because I think there may be some other questions, and are willing to let us put this at the rear end of our reconvene the work session after the council meeting.
Yep.
We can maybe go for a few minutes more and get some, because there's another area or two I think we ought to discuss since we have everybody here. Is that all right with you?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Thank you, guys.
You bet.
Thank you.
You bet. The next item, this is a neighborhood meeting regarding CPAFY2022-0005. And this is regarding changes to our code that impact the Surel Mitchell Live-Work-Create district. Before we start this discussion, Jenna, you want to make your way to the podium? Jody, I want to just, as a preamble, the city, to my knowledge, has no interest in changing the brand of the Surel Mitchell Live-Work-Create district. We've got some some continuity issues in our code. We've had a judicial decision that is, as a result of a judicial decision, we have to change some aspects of our code. And there's a nexus there between the current language in the Live-Work-Create district and the judge's order. So I just wanted to say, I don't believe there's any interest on the council of abolishing in some fashion the notion that we are not going to continue to recognize the contributions Surel Mitchell made to the city, and that we have a brand that impacts that part of the town. So, but there are going to be some discussions about what's contained in that and whether the overlay should stay in place and be amended, or whether the overlay should go away, maintain the brand, and make some changes to the underlying zone. So tonight's just an introduction to that. No decisions are going to be made tonight, but I just wanted to create that context for you. So what we're doing won't be hopefully misunderstood. Fair enough? Okay. All right, Jenna.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. I do apologize. I was not in.
Did I not give you a heads up? I was going to call you up.
No, but that's fine, Mayor. I can wing it.
Mr. Mayor, would you like me to go over my memo instead, or would you like to?
Yeah, why don't you do that, Charlie? I just wanted to get this introduction made for the council and for any of those that are listening in person or online, so that we understand the challenge we have, the actions we need to take in some fashion, and what we're going to be considering in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My memo on this subject starts on page 27 of the council packet. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to hit a few highlights. So I'm summarizing the summary. Basically, what this says is because of judicial mandate, we need to fix some portions of our code. And so one thing that we have to change pursuant to judicial mandate is the criteria for approval of a design review application. The city has no discretion on that. We've been ordered to do that. And so the recommendation is this is what we should do. The other part of that is what to do with the Surel Mitchell overlay district. There's some deficiencies in there that we can fix. So that's one option, or the other option is to repeal it. And there's some other options as well. So if you're looking at your packet, my memorandum's on page 27. And I'll talk about that here in a minute, but I just want to give a brief high-level overview. On page 60, is what one ordinance could look like. And so what is on page 60 is one option of this ordinance, that is repealing the overlay district and also fixing the deficiencies that are in the design review criteria. And then option B, and there are other options too, and I'm happy to serve whatever the council wants to do. Option B starts on page 95 of your packet, and that is to attempt to fix both the Surel Mitchell overlay district and to attempt to fix the required standards for any design review application. And so in the interest of time, I'm happy to stand for any questions that are in my memo, but my memo talks about several things. The main thing I want to highlight, I think tonight though, is if the council did want to repeal the overlay district, then we need to take a hard look at what our general parking regulations are, because if the Surel Mitchell parking regulations go away, then we default to the citywide parking regulations. And I have some concerns with it as it's currently written. So that's kind of like the summary of the summary. I stand for any questions, and in the interest of time, whatever the mayor and the council would like me to do. Thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any specific questions to start regarding this? Yes.
Mr. Wadhams?
Yes, Councilmember Jorgensen.
I want to be sure I'm very clear. The reason that we should consider modifying, repealing, or otherwise addressing this code specifically now, although we're undergoing major overhaul of the code for the city in general, is specifically because of the court order that we're operating under.
Yes, Councilmember Jorgensen, that's what this is. And I think that's a fair question. And I think that's something good to put on the record, is that there are, I have spotted some deficiencies in the development code. Mayor and council have spotted some deficiencies. The public has spotted some deficiencies. And I'm here to say, as the city attorney, I'm working as fast as I can to get them fixed. But there's a lot of things that we can improve on. This is just the first step, really. This is something that we have to do. We don't really have a lot of discretion. So this is just the first step of a long process that's going to be happening all summer long and beyond. I have a lot of people that are going to be working on this very soon. So this is just the first step of a long process. Councilmember Jorgensen.
As a follow-up, in your memo on page 44, you note that our code fails to meet Idaho code. And just for clarity, I want to ensure that the other codes from other cities that are being referenced do comply with Idaho code. Everything referenced from another city complies with Idaho code.
Well, they haven't been challenged like we've been challenged. And so the collateral issues on this is that we have one judge that has decided that there are portions of our code that are non-LUPA compliant. I think other jurisdictions under that, what's going to become precedent, we're going to have similar issues. So we're like at the tip of the spear on some of these issues, and we're at the tip of the spear because the judge told us we're at the tip of the spear. So, I think other jurisdictions likewise need to be cautious. I cannot vouch. I mean, I give you a lot of examples, but I cannot give you a legal conclusion that they are legally sufficient.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Are you done?
Thank you.
Yes.
I do just want to ask a couple things to be sure for everyone in the room and listening that's not in the room. When you talk about the overlay district, Surel Mitchell overlay district, are we identifying the area east of 36th, south of Adams, extending to the, I guess, the end of Garden City, as before it goes up the bench to Boise, and then ending on the western border at the far side of the Riverside Hotel and that little tiny piece south of Chinden? Is that the overlay district? And I get these boundaries from a non-binding comprehensive plan. Well, so that's what I want to make sure we're talking about.
Well, Council President, Page, I would like if Jenna could come up and answer that, because I'm not exactly sure what the defined boundary of this overlay district is, but I know Ms. Thornborough knows.
Yeah, it seems ambiguous, and I'm not trying to say that to be clever.
No, but that's absolute. Council President Page,
I've seen maps that show that.
Yeah, we need to have a clearly defined boundary on any of our overlay districts. That's one of the things we need.
Mayor, Councilmember Page, that is my understanding. I was going to pull up code very quickly because I believe that there is a map that does show the exact location that's in question.
Ms. Thornberry, oh, you should share.
Mayor, Councilmember Page, as you can see, right under applicability, there's a description of everything east of 37th Street within Garden City's boundary that this overlay applies to.
Okay, thank you also for a record of making sure we're talking about the same thing. And I'll just ask the city attorney, when we talk about the overlay, we'll just try to refer to it today as the overlay, but our code and the comprehensive plan differ on the exact nomenclature of the overlay. I've seen Surel Mitchell Live-Work-Create, and I've seen Surel Mitchell Work-Live-Create. Both are in writing. What is the proper reference? Are we working before living or living before working?
Mayor, Councilmember Page, during the last larger revisit of the comprehensive plan, because of the vernacular that's widely used within the community, it was decided within the comprehensive plan process to change it to live, work, create, whereas code still has the work, live, create.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jen, I have a quick question too. So how many times has the overlay actually been used for approved development?
Mayor, Councilmember Jacobs, to my recollection, I believe that there are 2 properties that have utilized the overlay for development projects.
Have any of those actually been constructed?
Councilmember Jacobs, Mayor, Councilmember Jacobs, to the best of my knowledge, while there are active approvals in place for those, both of those that I can think of off the top of my head, they have not been constructed to date.
And one of those is the ones we had the legal issue with.
That's correct. That's Councilmember Jacobs. That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Wadhams.
Council President Page.
Follow-up question. So the Surel Mitchell overlay, I guess for everyone's clarification, do you fall within the constraints of the overlay, or I guess the welcoming arms of the overlay, because of how you're using the land, or because of Surel's legacy, what Surel accomplished, and sort of a memorial to Surel?
Council President Page, in my mind, in my view, I think it's both. I don't, Ms. Thornberry's coming back up, but in my mind, I think it was both.
Mayor, Councilmember Page, the Surel Mitchell overlay within code is a voluntary district that you can use in lieu of your base zoning district. The intent is at a 1-to-1 live to work ratio. So if you wanted to have a business and a residence within the same property, that is when you would utilize that overlay district. The Surel Mitchell Live, Work, Create district within the comprehensive plan is a separate designation where the city has identified an area and some parameters of the vision of that area of the city.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the word ratio. That's my next question. We have some discussion and I think judicial reference to that as well, about this idea of someone living in the space where the work is being done. And as I look at the proposed amendments before us, and by that I mean the amendment to modify, not the amendment to revoke. You know, I see language of the possibility of an employee living in the space rather than the, I guess, the creator of record. So if I'm a craft knife maker and I live in my home and grind knives in my workspace, and I have a helper that comes to work but doesn't live there, now I have this workplace that has a different feel and some different legality to it because it's a workplace, different than the liabilities I have as a homeowner grinding knives on my own. You know, if a piece of errant metal flies into my eye, I'm a homeowner and I choose to do that, I create in my home. But if a errant piece of metal grinds off into my employee's eye, now there's an OSHA claim. And now there's a state insurance inspector coming out. Is this environment, is my home a safe workplace? There's some tough questions that have to be answered and some potential liabilities. So, you know, when we're looking at modifying this code, I want to be careful about this idea of, I guess, employees living in a space. I think we need to look at that from a risk management perspective.
Well, Council President, if I may, also looking at the clock at 6:02, to give you a preview of where this is headed, there are hearings already set in front of, or meetings, hearings and meetings set in front of the Design Review Committee. Because this process is, first we have to have a neighborhood meeting, and that's what we did this evening, along with the work session. Then it goes back to design review, and that's currently set, and Ms. Thornbell has the dates if anybody needs them. Then it goes to planning and zoning for their recommendation. They're both recommending bodies. And then it's going to be back in front of the council, so the council can make the tough decisions as the final decision maker here. So that's the public process that we have going forward. As we've now done the neighborhood meeting, we'll get recommendations from design review, we'll get recommendations from planning and zoning, and it'll be back on your desk in the next month or two.
Great. Jody, I want to give you an opportunity to say something if you'd like to. It's kind of informal here, and it is a public neighborhood meeting. You're in the neighborhood. If you have any specific questions, we got the letter from Greg, and understand that. If there's anything additional to that you'd like to convey, this will be a process, and there'll be a lot of opportunities to discuss. Can I get you to come up to the mic?
Mayor,
Sorry.
If I may, while Jody is coming up to the mic, and just for those that are interested, the corresponding public hearings right now are scheduled for May 2nd in front of the Design Review Committee at 3 p.m.
Okay.
Wednesday, May 18th in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission at 6:30 p.m. and Monday, May 23rd back in front of the City Council.
Okay. This really isn't the public hearing, but I've known Jody for years. He's been an anchor in that district down there, very active. And so I'm exercising my prerogative to ask him if he has anything to add. So.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. Jody Eichelberger, 440 East Thurman Mill in the Surel Mitchell Live-Work-Create district, and also the program director at Surel's Place. We did have some concern, and I appreciate the mayor's comments before the meeting that we were going to lose the name of our district, which has become important to us. But I appreciate the city planner's comments that it was two-pronged, that Surel herself worked in planning and zoning, and it was important to her that it wasn't just name only, but also there was some substance behind it, that there was a function that replicated the spirit of what she did with her own home, which was to have a place that she lived and also that she worked. In her own case, that was creating visual art, but it was a separation of public and private space, but actually not even separate buildings. If you haven't been to the house, it's one house with a gallery studio space at the front and more private living quarters in the back. So we would like to encourage the mayor and the city attorney and the people working to do this to continue to consider and pursue fixing the code as opposed to just eliminating it, so that there is the possibility of someone using what Surel herself was able to create in her life, which was a designation for both private and public use on the same property. And we will do our best to help support that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jody, very much. Oh,
Mr. Mayor,
yes.
Ms. Carver Herbert had her hand up.
Well, I'm gonna kind of stop it there because we're gonna have a lot of public hearings. The reason I exercised my prerogative was a personal, I've known Jody for years, and he is in the heart of that district. They took the time to write a letter that we all received. And I need to get into the council meeting, but you've got my number, Wendy.
I do.
Okay.
Yes, I work more about process.
Right.
My question, a little bit of concerns are already beginning public hearing assumption that we know, I mean, right now, the way it's laid out, there are these options that are available.
Sure. Sure. This was just a neighborhood meeting to introduce anybody that was interested, what the issue or what the topic is basically with both these things. But they go through the standard process, starting at design review, planning and zoning, and then back to the council. So, so that's where we are. There won't be any. I didn't hear your question.
Would you consider one work session prior to the official neighborhood meeting? So one community work session?
Well, we've combined the work session and neighborhood meeting tonight just to introduce it, because the purpose of a neighborhood meeting is so anyone who's interested after the notice has been distributed, purpose of neighborhood meetings to inform anyone who's interested about what the topic is. And then once you do that, then it gets into the normal process where there are staff reports written and public hearings held and the formalized public discussion. So, and of course, anyone that has anything to add certainly can communicate with the mayor and council at any time. We're all in the book, so to speak. So these are legislative matters at this point. So there aren't prohibitions to contact with the electeds that represent you. Okay, with that, I'm going to adjourn the work session. We'll reconvene to see if we can get a couple of more questions answered after the council meeting regarding the tiny home on wheels issue. With that, we will convene the regular city council meeting at 6:09 and ask the clerk to certify the meeting notice.
This meeting has been noticed in accordance with Idaho Code 74-204.
Have the clerk call the roll, please.
Councilmember Heller.
Present.
Councilmember Jacobs.
Here.
Councilmember Jorgensen.
Here.
Councilmember Page.
Here.
Thank you. Stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Are there any changes to the agenda? Hearing none. Before we move on to the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor, just a point of order.
Yes.
Were you gonna, was part of the Mr. Jones's work session going to be included in the regular council meeting?
No, we're just going to reconvene the work session at the end of the council meeting. So it's just a recess of the work session.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move to the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor, I move to approve the consent agenda.
Okay.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, clerk call roll.
Councilmember Heller,
Yes.
Councilmember Jacobs,
Yes.
Councilmember Jorgensen,
Yes.
Councilmember Page.
Yes.
Thank you. Item F, special business. Item F1 is an extension request for condominium plat located at 9557 West State Street. Is there someone here representing that request? Yes, please join us. You would give us your name and address for the record and why you need an extension.
Of course. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. Stephanie Hopkins with KM Engineering, 5725 North Discovery Way in Boise, 83713. We are requesting a time extension for condominium plat that was approved last February for 44 units for the Sleepy Hollow apartments that are over off of State Street. We're requesting an extension of time because we'd initially wanted to call them the Sleepy Hollow condominiums, as is reflected by the project, but that wasn't a reservable a name with Ada County. We found out a little bit too late. We'd started routing the plat, excuse me, and basically it kind of already gone into our year time frame that we had to record it, and realized that we needed to change the name, which took some time, and then getting the plat routed back through took additional time. So just altogether took more time than we initially had slated. I did create a little presentation just to show you. So this is where it's located.
I'm not laughing at you. I'm
Sure.
smiling because in my other life, I have experienced those kinds of surprises.
Yeah. Yeah, we just wanted it to be a consistent name and didn't even think that it had already been reserved. So this is just, so there were 44 units approved last February, 4 residential buildings and 1 office. Each of the units will be condominiumized to allow for separate ownership. So there'll be condominiums for folks to own separately. The garages are also condominiumized for separate ownership. So this is just this is what the site plan looks like. And this is an example of how they're divided up. There's some common limited space for folks, as well as shared space between the units in the center. So.
Where was that exactly? Can you go back to the first of,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to visualize where exactly that is.
Sure, it's south of State, kind of kitty corner to Duncan Lane and east of Ulmer. So
Okay.
just east of the Foothills Christian Church that's there.
Yes, I've been looking at that vacant field for a long time.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Dave's is.
The apartment buildings, I think, are close to completion, if not already complete. And I don't know if they have certificate of occupancy. Well, so those were already approved. The building permits and everything have been approved. This is just to kind of divide up airspace of the constructed buildings.
Right. I drive by it every day, so I'm like,
Yeah.
It's not, doesn't look like that.
Yeah, the aerial is incorrect.
Hey, sorry.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
I find based on Ms. Hopkins' testimony that there's good cause. And I see a council member.
I apologize for interrupting, but Mr. Mayor, since you did chime in, I did have a question. How does this happen that an application gets so far down the process and then we find out that the name was inadvertently reserved by another or unavailable?
Well,
if you don't know, we could ask Jamie.
Well, it happens. You have to get approval through Ada County on the name.
Right.
And it could have been a human error. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, I think, that you just, somebody misses it. There's an assumption made.
But is there anything that we as a city can do to help prevent it happening in the future?
The onus really is on the applicant. Part of the application process. I don't know what happened in this case. The name could have been available when they started the process and could have not been available by the time they got down the road because somebody else beat them to the contract. I don't know. I think the motivation for it not to happen is on the applicant because I'm sure they would prefer not to come back and have to do this. This also, this piggybacks into, as we get into our code revisions, in this environment we're in, a 1-year approval is folly. you just can't get things done in a year anymore. So that's something I hope the council will take a hard look at when we get to that, can take a year to get the windows replaced in your house, for crying out loud. And that's
certainly limit the number of extensions.
Yeah. So anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You're welcome. I did get a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. Did you complete your motion?
I don't think you did.
I can restate the motion.
Okay, restate the motion.
It was this, Mr. Mayor, I find based on Ms. Hopkins' testimony that good cause exists to grant an extension to SUB FY 2021-0004.
Second. Okay, we got a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, clerk call roll.
Councilmember Jacobs?
Yes.
Councilmember Jorgensen?
Yes.
Councilmember Page?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item F2, this is another extension request, DSR FY 2021-11. Boise is requesting an extension for the combined pre-application conference and formal hearing with the design review committee approval at 208 East 33rd. Mr. Jones.
Jason Jones, 208 East 33rd Street, Garden City, Idaho. So yeah, we're just here to request an extension. If you've read I guess everybody had the documentation, right? So everybody's probably read, but effectively there was a judicial review. And so another form of the same application that was approved is now on the table as a possibility to build. So that's one of the issues. I mean, obviously there's also supply issues. This project is a shipping container project, and the pandemic has created some supply chain issues along with that too. And so that's why we're requesting an extension, because we kind of knew we had some legal issues ongoing. And so really our question now is going to be, what project do we build? And so we're kind of looking at that with architects to make sure that we build the best project we can. So,
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
Mr. Jones, I'm not really good at remembering the numbers of the applications, and of course I know the background, so thanks for that. This extension is
this is
for the one just came through judicial review, or the prior?
It's the one that was actually approved by the city. So the one that just went through judicial review is another version of it. Sure. But this is the one that was actually approved.
I'm going to pivot with that, and a follow-up question for legal counsel, Mr. Wadhams. Then, what is the due process if we were to find good cause here and grant the extension the applicant's asking? And then the applicant decides to go with the preferred project that was the subject of litigation. How will this decision affect that potentially?
Well, Council President, the way I see it right now is he currently has two approvals. He has one that was previously approved in 2021. That's one we're currently on, and he's asking for an extension. And then there's the one that was approved to Judge Medema. So right now he has two approvals. There's nothing in our code that would prohibit two approvals. And so he has two approvals. And so where it is right now is I think he could pick door number one or door number two. And right now he's just asking for an extension on door number two.
And essentially the first one that was part of judicial review, since it was just approved, has a year time frame on it already. So you have two 1-year time frames on both of them.
Right.
Is that true?
We're correct, Councilmember Jacobs. The one that Judge Medema approved, that's for 365 days, and that was passed by council, I think, the council meeting before last. And on this one, he's asking for an extension on this one. So in effect, you have two parallel approvals going on at the same time, and then it'd be up to Mr. Jones on which one he wants to build.
Thank you. My reading of it was different, so thank you for the clarification. I was under the understanding that this was compulsory from the bench, the approval of the other project.
No, Council President Page, this is the one that the council already approved.
Thank you.
So in other words, it's the third in time. The one that Judge Medema looked at was the first in time.
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Jones, what is your intention for the site? Are you leaning one way or the other? What do you have a vision for what you want?
I mean, obviously we started on construction documents for this approved version here. And obviously we thought that judicial review might come up sooner than it had. The court dates got stretched out. And so we kind of had to stretch out our construction document drawing process because we really didn't know whether this one would be approved, the other version that now got approved through the court. You know, and again, they're very different projects in the design. I think obviously since we started this one, we're kind of leaning that way on the one that we would look for the extension on, you know, because things have changed even in the market. And so we're really not sure. Like I said, there's some things that were enforced in this third one that we're asking for the extension on that make it less attractive than the first one. But at the same time, like I said, there's some things within the third one that are more attractive too. You know, like, so for example, we had about twice as much residential in the third project as the first project. So we basically doubled the residential and we cut the amount of workspaces in half. And, you know, obviously the market has moved toward a more residential market. So in a way, this project that was approved, it is more appealing because of just those market forces. So I think that's one of the balancing issues. Now, we also ended up with, you know, there were some decisions along the way that moved our setbacks in a little more and things like that, that changed that between the first and third. And so, like I said, it's still a little bit up in the air, but I would say at least at this point, we've already put some money into the construction documents for this third version.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor and Mr. Wadhams, I do think that to President of the Council's point, it's disturbing that in our code, we have this hole. And I would like to see that added to the list of code issues that need to be addressed. I'm not super fond of the code being silent on something that could really, I think, create a lot of headache down the road. So not for tonight, but I would ask that be added to the
Councilmember Jorgensen, Mayor, it is on the list, and it'll be up to the Mayor and Council to decide whether you want that regulation or whether you do not want that regulation. But it's on the list. Yes, Councilman.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions on the extension request? Okay, thank you, Mr. Jones. It's a pleasure to council.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
Based on the testimony of Mr. Jones and input from legal counsel, I find good cause exists to grant an extension for DSRFY to 2021-11 and move for the same.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, clerk call the roll.
Councilmember Jorgensen?
Yes.
Councilmember Page?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
Councilmember Jacobs?
Yes.
Thank you. Item F3, Arbor Day proclamation. Usually print these, so give me a minute. I've got to find it. Oh, thank you. Andy having someone that prints it.
Exactly.
Whereas in 1872, J. Sterling Morton proposed to the Nebraska Board of Agriculture that a special day be set aside for the planting of trees, and whereas the holiday called Arbor Day was first observed with the planting of more than 1 million trees in Nebraska, and whereas Arbor Day is now observed throughout the nation and the world, and whereas trees can reduce the erosion of our precious topsoil by wind and water, lower our heating and cooling costs, moderate the temperature, clean the air, produce oxygen, and provide habitat for wildlife. And whereas trees are a renewable resource, giving us paper, wood for our homes, fuel for our fires, and countless other wood products. And whereas trees in our city increase property values, enhance the economic vitality of business areas, and beautify our community. And whereas trees, wherever they are planted, are a source of joy and spiritual renewal. Now therefore, I, John G. Evans, Mayor of the City of Garden City, Idaho, do hereby proclaim May 5th, 2022 as Arbor Day, and I urge all citizens to celebrate Arbor Day to support efforts to protect our trees and woodlands. And further, I urge all citizens to plant and care for trees to gladden the heart and promote the well-being of this and future generations. In witness whereof, I hereunto set my hand on this 25th day of April, 2022. Item F4, monthly staff reports are in your packet for your review. Are there any questions? We've got 3 staff members here.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I do have a question for Ms. Thornborough.
Okay.
And this is similar to the question I asked earlier, and strictly for my education. So in your report under in construction, we have the Sleepy Hollow condominiums. So now in future, it will be referred to as the new name.
Mayor, Councilmember Jorgensen, yes, that is something that we do need to update throughout our files. As it came through the process under Sleepy Hollow, pretty much all of our documentation at the city is under the Sleepy Hollow, but we will go back and fix what we can.
So sorry to interrupt. So my follow-up question, and again, this is just educating me, how will we track that? You know, will it be the new name formerly known as the Sleepy Hollow so that we could track it through the process?
Mayor, Councilmember Jorgensen, we can certainly do that. Luckily, we track everything through a file number as well. And so there will be a file number that's associated all the way through. I do note that the staff reports don't have those associated file numbers for brevity's sake, but we can certainly add the file numbers back in.
Yeah, I don't know that the file numbers are critical, but as long as there's something for us to reference back to what it was originally under, so I won't forget.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mr. Thornborough.
Good. Any other questions? Staff reports. Okay, moving on, we'll go to item G1. This is a public hearing, resolution 1120-22. This is authorizing the abandonment and vacation of a 10-foot utility easement on lot 29, block 2, in the waterfront district. This information is contained in the packet. Does anyone have questions? Colin, this would be a Colin question if we have any. Certainly our public works director, our city engineer, our staff has looked at these. This is a relative routine matter. But if there are questions, I'll certainly have Colin come up.
And Mr. Mayor, just point of order, there is one legal issue I'd like to put on the record whenever appropriate as well.
Well, go ahead and put it on the record.
All right, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, looking at the packet, and Ms. Thornborough wanted me to look at something, and it was regarding the wording of the proposed resolution. And that's proposed resolution 1120-22. I think that's where we are right now. Our engineer, Joe Canning, just had a question, and what I'm going to suggest is that the council pass this resolution with one added line. And I would suggest that there be a whereas added that makes it very clear that ACHD's storm drain easement on lot 29, their easements on lot 29 are not being vacated. Just
right. This is just our easement that's being vacated.
Right.
Not
Mr. Canning was just a little concerned about that, if I understand.
Mayor, members of the council, another point of clarification on that. While that was discussed in Mr. Parks's materials and Mr. Canning, I might add the ACHD sidewalk easement as well, just to be overly clear.
This is exclusive to Garden City's easement. Okay. With that, I'll open the public hearing. And is anyone signed up to testify?
There's not there.
Okay. Anyone that's joined us online want to testify? Oh, I'm sorry. I was too quick. You would.
I didn't sign up, but I'm an applicant, so I didn't know if there were any questions that I could address. For the record, Matthew Parks, 802 West Bannock Street, Suite LLP 110.
My apologies. I should have asked if the applicant's representative is up here. Sometimes we deal with these internally administratively and they come to the council for approval. If questions come up, I'm going to reserve the right to bring you back up.
Thank you. And just for the record, we have no objections to the change the language in the resolution, and that was the intent as well, not to vacate the ACHD stormwater easement nor the sidewalk easement.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Did you get his name and everything? Yes. Okay. Okay. We had any indication of anyone wanting to testify online?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. I've got a Semerson hand up. Is that?
That might be the cursor. Is
Pardon
that your
me?
cursor?
Yeah, I think that's the mouse.
Oh, sorry. That's the cursor.
Oh, okay. Well, it looked like a hand. Okay, let the record reflect that there was no additional testimony other than from the applicant. Any discussion on the council before I close the hearing? Any questions that haven't been answered? Okay, hearing no questions, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing, turn it to the council for action.
Mr. Mayor,
Go ahead.
I move that we approve the vacation of the easement for Garden City's easement on the piece of property. And as well add the language where it is not vacated from ACHD stormwater or sidewalk easements.
Second. They've got a motion and a second. It's accurate to represent the motion is in regard to resolution 1120-22, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That is the second, understand that?
Yes.
Okay. We've got a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, clerk call the roll.
Councilmember Page,
Yes.
Councilmember Heller,
Yes.
Councilmember Jacobs,
Yes.
Councilmember Jorgensen.
Yes.
Thank you. Next item is resolution 1121-22, approving the small wireless facilities master license agreement template. Mr. Waddles.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have two related things, and I'm going to start with this resolution 1121-22 is to approve a master license agreement template. And I mean, I'll cut to the short on both of these, the proposed resolution 1121 and proposal resolution 1122. At the end of this evening's presentation and I guess some deliberation, I'm going to ask for the matters to be continued until the next meeting in May. There are just a couple questions that we need to ferret out. And just to give a big picture of this, these are regarding small wireless facilities, or some people know them as 5G. You'll see the standalone poles or some other poles in Boise, in Meridian, and some surrounding areas. And so what this is that this is so we can have 5G in our community. In order to have 5G in our community, the industry has to update the technology. And so the city has to decide several things, like what does that look like? Should there be a master license agreement for each one of the providers, or should it just be site specific? On this one, I'm recommending a master license agreement. That's what the industry is recommending, and that's what a lot of other jurisdictions do. So there's three pieces so we can have 5G in Garden City. One is deciding whether for the council, the mayor, to decide whether there should be a master license agreement. And my memo starting on page 243 of your packet addresses that. What a master license agreement is it's a long-term agreement with a particular provider. Could be Verizon, it could be AT&T, it could be Crown Castle, could be any one of them. And it says we're going to be, as long as you follow the rules, we're going to allow you to put these up within the time specific under the master license agreement. Now, this master license agreement is for 10 years with a one automatic renewal for another 10 years. I know Councilmember Jorgensen suggested that maybe a term less than 10 years would be appropriate. I did take that back to the industry, and one of the representatives of Verizon, Jason's right here. If there's specific questions, Verizon is in the house. But the industry, I think, will tell you that because the huge expense of the infrastructure, that they are not in it for 5 years, but they are in it for a 10-year term with a 10-year automatic renewal. So I guess one of the first questions, and we've talked about this before in front of council, is does the council want a master license agreement? I think that's question number one, or do you just want it site specific? So the way this is set up and the way it's recommended is there's going to be a 10-year agreement with each provider. And then for each facility, they have to come in and ask for a site license. And if they meet our parameters, whatever the mayor and the council decide those parameters are, then they get their site license. They can put in their what they call the small wireless facility, and boom, then they can start broadcasting 5G. And so that's what the master license agreement is. I do have a few unanswered questions. We could try to answer them tonight, or you could just give me another couple of weeks for me to look at it. And just so that council's aware of the process, is there are a lot of hands in the cookie jar on this right here. So I got a template. I consulted with development services with what kind of template they would like under a master license agreement. I consult with some consultants. I consult with some other city attorneys, and then I consult with the industry. And so I'm getting red lines from AT&T, red lines from Verizon, red lines from Crown Castle, red lines from Miss Thornborough, and I'm trying to put them all together and make everybody happy. As you all know, it's sometimes hard to catch all the red lines, and so I think maybe a few of the red lines have been missed. But that's what the master license agreement is. And I know Jason, I've been working with Jason. Verizon's been great to work with, and he's here to answer any questions that are beyond my expertise. Turning just to fast forward for another minute, on page 278 is the other resolution, and that's the other related resolution, and that's regarding design standards. And so I'm happy to talk about that when appropriate, but that's the second piece of the puzzle. And then the third piece of the puzzle is we're going to need a code amendment, and we're not at the code amendment stage quite yet. That has to go through, I think it's maybe already gone through the neighborhood meeting, but we'll probably have another neighborhood meeting. Goes in front of design review, goes in front of planning and zoning, and then it comes back in front of the council. But as I explained to the industry and as I explained to Ms. Thornborough, I know that we have two council members here that probably have no idea what I'm talking about except for their review of the memo. So I just wanted to give everybody an opportunity for the new council members if they had any particular questions. Verizon's in the house, or I'm happy to answer them as well. But the main questions for tonight are, do the council want a master license agreement? And if the answer is yes, what does that look like? And then looking to the other proposed resolution, the 1122-22. And I know I'm skipping around a little bit, but what do those design standards look like for small wireless facilities? And so that's kind of where we are. I stand for questions.
Mr. Williams, I just have a quick question. So my understanding, I'm kind of familiar a little bit with what we're trying to do. So master agreement, one agreement, multiple carriers. If they all share a pole, say, does a shared unit, I guess, do anything with the master agreement, or is that in the master agreement?
Well, that's not specifically in the master agreement, and maybe that's something Jason could speak to right now, because that's called co-locating.
Yeah,
and there's some issues that so Jason's been really patient with me trying to teach me all this technology, and a lot of it's over my head. But one thing I understood is that a lot of times they don't like to co-locate, and
so we have poles everywhere.
Well,
in that sense, so I mean, that's the master agreement. So that's for that pole, this pole, that pole, by carrier.
I think the answer, well, that's a tricky question. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, would you like to hear from Jason? I know he could answer that.
If this is mainly about the master agreement, which sounds great, maybe that I'm asking design questions. I just didn't know if the master agreement incorporated any aspects of co-share.
No. The master agreement, administratively, the master agreement's the staff preference.
Okay.
And we aren't separately, it minimizes the separate processes with multiple different carriers.
So my other question was,
so and there's some, as Charlie said, there's some additional things. Typically, in my experience, co-location is not something that's preferred.
Good. I understand.
And there are technical reasons and probably other reasons. And I think just for the record, Charlie, you might just indicate basically what our limitations in a regulatory fashion are regarding 5G. So
sure.
we're operating under an umbrella of a higher authority with limited regulatory local authority. So if you just briefly, if you can.
Sure,
I understand.
Mayor and Council, this is one of the issues that they call preemption. The federal government has preempted municipalities and counties on what they can and cannot regulate or prohibit. Cities and counties cannot prohibit these small wireless facilities. This is infrastructure. The FCC says that that there will be 5G. This is an infrastructure that the cities will allow to come in. There cannot be an unreasonable restriction to the technology coming in. What the counties and the cities can do is regulate design standards as long as they're reasonable. So there's a lot of different moving parts. In the past, I've been asked, should we require a conditional use permit? I'm recommending against a conditional use permit for the main reason is that it would take too long. There's something in the industry that they call a shot clock, and it's either 60 days or 90 days. And if they don't get their approval or the review done within 60 or 90 days, depending on the type of application it is, this is deemed approved. So we have a shot clock where we have to come up with a decision within 60 or 90 days. And I just think a conditional use permit, we're not gonna be able to make the shot clock on a conditional use permit. We're preempted from prohibiting them. There are some groups, I think maybe one is Idahoans for a safe frequency or something like that. They have health concerns, but the FCC has come back and said these are safe. And local governments, it doesn't matter if you think they're safe or not, because you're preempted from making that decision. They are coming in, and that's the end of that story. But what the city does have control on is design standards. We go back and forth on how tall they should be. Should they be taller on major roads and shorter in residentials? That can cut both ways, I've learned. The shorter they are, the more you need. So if you want them real short, you're going to have them everywhere. If you let them to be a little taller, then not as frequent. So there's a lot into it. As I've learned over the last couple of years, there's a lot to it. But tonight, does the council want a master license agreement? And does the council have any preferences that I can take back and incorporate? And then when we get into the design review, that I'm more interested in what the council thinks about the design criteria, because that's where the council has a lot of discretion. Do they look different in residentials compared to right on Chinden? What do they look like? That's the purview of the council here tonight.
That will likely be another work session.
Right.
That topic.
And the two new council members, Councilmember Jacobs and Councilmember Heller, I just wanted to give this to you so you can start thinking about it. The industry is ready to go. As soon as we have everything in place, they're going to start installing these things in Garden City. So,
yes. No, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Wadhams, that was my question. I had the impression from the recommendations of staff that these polls could vary depending on the neighborhood and the historical setting of or the utility of a given block in the city. So, but that'll be decided in another work session then? Is that'll be up for discussion then?
Well, I don't know if we're prepared to get into the design issue tonight. I guess
this is about the master.
Yeah, that's what the next resolution is about design. So
yeah,
you do
we've
have
got them both.
Yeah, I didn't want to push the agenda. I was just curious if I'm understanding correctly that these polls are going to vary depending on input.
If they're ready to go and they decide to go, then the shot clock starts, and I think that constitutes some constructive notice that we better be able to come to an agreement on the design, because in an application, I presume you'd have to tell us where they're going. And that is, there's going to be a presumption on how tall they're going to be. So I think there's probably, given if Verizon is ready to go, I'm getting a head nod that it is, then there's some urgency in getting this done. So what I would recommend is, on the topic of the master license agreement, are there issues the council would like Charlie to look at based on your review of the packet that he needs to incorporate, assuming you are willing to go the master license agreement avenue, which would be certainly my preference. I think as far as those on the Dias here, Charlie's well suited to advise us on the various nuances that we need to consider in that master license agreement. After looking through the prism of the regulatory constraints we have, as well as the legitimate needs of the vendors that are going to come in. If you give us the go-ahead on the master license agreement, you have his number. If you come across something that you don't understand or you want further clarification on, you can always call him. But I think at this point, if there's something specific, let's bring it up now on the master license agreement.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Having reviewed the information in the packet and having previously reviewed the proposal master license agreement, I would move that we move forward unless there's a desire from the new members of the council to wait and postpone this or move it to another date.
There's not on my part.
Nor mine. I'll second your, if that's a motion.
I would make a motion to approve resolution 1121-22.
Second.
Okay, and that would be, can I ask you if that would be subject to review by the city attorney for not to change the intent, but for administrative clerical corrections or
errors that may be found?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good enough, Charlie?
Yeah, and that covered it because there's a couple things I want to tweak, but if that motion passes, that gives me the discretion to tweak them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I've got a motion and second on resolution 1121-22. Is any further discussion? Hearing none, clerk call the roll.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
Councilmember Jacobs?
Yes.
Councilmember Jorgensen?
Yes.
Councilmember Page?
Yes.
Thank you. Next item G3, resolution 1122-22. Approving the facility design standards. We have some advantage, we being the incumbent members up here versus councilors Heller and Jacobs. I think we've had some, more than one, I'll put it that way, work sessions to talk about metered versus non-metered, specific standard designs, which there are several examples that we have in the packet or have reviewed, height versus numbers. So we've talked about a lot of those things. So I'm not sure
Mr. Mayor,
what the council wants to do.
I would propose that we move this to another date to allow more time and effort in reviewing the standards. This is, I think, pretty particular, and I think the opinions of the new council members would be very valuable in defining what the aesthetics and the location and definition of these would be.
Okay. Is there, I think we.
And Mr. Mayor, just point of order, can I just give a little preview of my memo just for the new council members before we vote on the motion?
You certainly can.
Okay.
We don't actually have a motion. She's indicated a preference, so we're still motionless.
All right. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to get in the middle of a motion. Okay. Well, Your Honor, my memo on this starts on page 278 of the packet, right. And this is, I think, even more nuanced than the master license agreement. I think the design standards are something that you might hear from your constituents about if they don't like them. So this is something I would recommend tread lightly. And there's a lot of technical things, but the update, I think for tonight's purposes, the main update is, I think the last time I was here, we had an issue with Idaho Power. Idaho Power was not in a position to accept the design of having a detached meter. That they wanted the, I mean, there was a deal with the meter, but now Idaho Power is on the same page. I think we've passed that hurdle or jumped over that hurdle. So now Idaho Power is on board. One of the things you'll notice for some people that were paying attention on the design standards, there were 4 different types of design. We've completely taken out category 4 because those are going to be regulated by ACHD staff's recommendation, but it's ultimately up to the council. If staff's recommendation is if ACHD is regulating them, that we're not going to regulate them too. We're just going to trust ACHD to regulate them. So we took out category 4 small wireless facilities altogether. So now there's just 3 different categories that are on the design standards. I think we have Idaho Power on board, so that hurdle has been passed. But the actual design standards as proposed are start on page 304 of your packet. And you'll see there's type 1, there's type 2, and type 3. We took off type 4 altogether because those are ACHD regulations. And hopefully the council is fine with that recommendation. But then it gets really technical. And so what color would the council like them to be? How tall would the council like them to be? So on and so forth. And those decisions are really above my pay grade. Those are for the mayor and the council to decide, not me.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I didn't notice in the packet, is there a map of where all of these things would go?
well, we don't
How
have
many, and since every carrier wants their own, I mean, are they going to be literally, I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand is that do we have a map of?
We aren't going to have a map, Councilmember Jacobs, until they know how tall they can be.
Okay, so that's all dependent on height because how tall they are.
And we won't have a comprehensive map at all initially. Verizon put their system in. If they're first in, AT&T could come in a year from now. Someone else could come in 3 years from now. So, you know, we're not going to know that up front. So I think if we're going to attach a standard to the master license agreement, then I think the information, again, it gets kind of technical, but how they work in my mind is a little less important than how tall they're going to be and generally what are they going to look like. And they can't do anything, but they can do, we have examples in the packet of what they can do, so, or willing to do. And, you know, beauty and function are in the eye of the beholder to some degree. So we are, through this process, establishing a standard that can be applied through the master license agreement. So as whether it's this council or future councils have to deal with these as they proliferate, it won't be a cumbersome thing.
My understanding is like a subdivision, if they can't opt not to have them at their subdivision, is that correct?
That's
because
correct.
of the FCC rules. So you know, we prefer not to have them. That's not their choice.
The market's going to drive a lot of those decisions. And we have some options with replacing street lights with these facilities where they have a street light on them. And there can be some advantages to the city. And then there's an annual fee associated with them that have some benefit, I guess. So, you know, I just, anytime you have a discussion about designing anything with a group, it causes your mayor to start sweating profusely. So we did, at one point, the council was pretty comfortable with the things you're seeing in the packet. So I'm hoping we can drill down on something that we can apply. And I think if, since you're here, you probably can't, you still from up north? No, I'm in Reading. You're, oh, the light came on and you got down here. If you would join, I have a question for you. We'll get it on the record. You want to give us your name and address?
Yeah, of course. I'll give you the code. It's easier to. So Jason Verdusco, Verizon Wireless, 12877 West McMillan Road, Boise.
So, Jason, if you were going to have a recommendation for the council, maybe you can explain the offset between taller, fewer, shorter, more dense. And I think our concern is, if I'm wrong, interrupt me, but in the residential areas where we're going to hear about them, if you've got, you know, on Glenwood or Chinden, you know, you've got a different scenario, especially since we're even on Adams. Some of these areas where ACHD might be there, but in your neighborhood. So so walk us through that, and how far are you willing to cast your fate to the wind with, gee, I think 12 feet's high enough. No, I think 18 would be better. No,
Yeah.
you know, because I get concerned about the basis of the information on which we're basing the decision. So.
Well, I'd love to, Your Honor. Yes, so thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I mean, so if just kind of permission to speak freely. Yes. I mean, so obviously with the FCC order, they can't be any taller than 50 feet. So that's the max height. So that kind of at least narrows it down a little.
Any taller than?
No taller than 50 feet.
50 feet. Okay.
50 feet, yeah. For a design, so for a radio, like a propagation, kind of like the sweet spot is 25 to 40 feet. So somewhere in there is kind of where we like to see. We don't like to go anything less than 20 because it just, you know, the propagation of the radio frequencies, it just doesn't go as far, and things get in the way. And so that kind of, like I said, that 25 to kind of 40, you know, 45 foot, depending on what pole you're attaching to. Obviously, if it's a utility pole, it's going to be a little bit taller. You know, streetlights, and the nice thing is we're not having to like reinvent the wheel here. Like we have, you know, a couple hundred small cell sites in Boise. You know, we have a number in Meridian. So they're already out there. And the great thing is you know, Garden City isn't having to reinvent the wheel here. There's already designs here. And so, and just to kind of, you know, brief a couple of the new council members, essentially there's 4 components to every small cell. You got power and you got fiber, and that usually runs underground and, you know, in through the interior of the pole, unless it's, unless it's a Idaho power pole, so wood pole. And then you have, you know, radios, or so equipment, and then you have antennas. And antennas will always be at the top. And so the question goes, or is asked, or is begged, where does the radio or the equipment go? It can either go on the ground next to the pole, and go on the base of the pole, and go mid pole, or and go at the pole top with the antennas. So that's kind of like the breakdown. And so it's really to answer the question of like, hey, how tall, how many? That's going to be dependent on what the engineers kind of look at, you know, as we fill in the Treasure Valley area, because you know, we kind of 5G is the buzzword, but essentially we're looking at, you know, digital equity and inclusion. You know, we have all experienced multiple fiber providers, and, you know, digging up city streets, and fiber is important because that is an important component. But now we can get fiber speeds at, you know, doing it wirelessly now. And so that's a really big aspect of being able to do small wireless facilities in a city. And so provides that opportunity.
So if we had a general residential standard, by zone or by geography, so we have various densities and blah, blah, blah. And we looked at a range. I'm just blabbing now a little bit, but we looked at a range. I'm a little nervous about saying 25 feet is it in a residential area. Maybe that doesn't make sense in every residential area. So how would we deal with if it's, just to use your example, 25 to 45 feet in a residential area? to be determined when the engineering comes in, or where we have some kind of a second look, and you can answer Councilmember Jacobs' question on, we can have 17 of these, or we can have 27 of these.
Yeah,
I think it's tough. We can't answer that tonight.
Yeah, and actually one question I do have, which would probably be for planning, is there already height restrictions in the city code already?
Well, for buildings, there are. Aren't they, isn't it 35 feet, Jenna? Probably wrong. I probably shouldn't have said that. Depends on the zone, I imagine. Or there's no height restrictions.
Yeah, exactly.
Mayor, members of the council, the mayor's second answer is the correct answer. It depends on the zoning district, what the height requirement may be. As this process has gone on, one of the things that's been discussed actually with the city council, with the design review committee and with the Parks and Waterway committee was really looking at perhaps instead of zoning districts, the street designation. So if you have an arterial like Glenwood, Veterans Memorial, State Street, and Chinden, perhaps those design standards look slightly different than a residential neighborhood. Or even a mixed use neighborhood. So a collector, you have your arterials, your collectors, and then your local streets. Thank you.
I just had a point of clarification. So the 50-foot restriction, that's from ground level or from install level?
Total height.
Okay, so you can't put one on top of the building. That's a big example.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So, Mr. Mayor, if I may, I see on the Zoom there are some, I think Kathy, PUTT, she maybe is with Crown Castle, and I maybe had that wrong, but I see there are a couple of people. I don't know if anybody else wanted to chime in. Another thing that I wanted to say though is they're primarily interested in right of way. So they want to put these things in right of way. And they initially want to affix to current infrastructure. And then so they want to do that first. So they think of it and their propagation maps. I think they call them propagation maps. They do these things in phases. So they want to put them in the right of way, and they want to put them on existing infrastructure first, if I have that right.
Yeah, so being a former right of way agent at a state and federal level for the first 15 years of my career, we don't want to clutter the right of way. So we always try to attach to existing infrastructure. You know,
how does that work if none of you want to be standalone? So in my neighborhood, I've got 5 poles, let's say street lights. Great, use the same infrastructure. I've got 6 carriers, and you guys don't want to co-locate, right? If you all co-locate it, it's one thing, but that's the question I have is everybody wants to use it, but you only have so many existing infrastructure. You've got a lot. I don't know how many carriers we have, but I can name 5 off the top of my head. How does that work?
Yeah, when we need to install freestanding small wireless facility, we will. We do have some in the Boise or in the city of Boise. And so, and regarding the co-location question, really from, it comes down to size and aesthetic standards, because so within a, when attaching to an existing pole, we have the FCC order. Not only does it limit the height, it also limits the size of the equipment and the size of the antennas we put on. And so now so Verizon maxes out our limits, and small cells aren't just for 5G, they're for 4G as well, right? And so it's so if we max out, Verizon maxes out its 4G, 5G antennas and equipment on one pole, and now AT&T comes in, and now another carrier comes in, all of a sudden you now have triple the amount. And is that really what the city wants?
No, right. I'm just wondering who gets what infrastructure.
Right. Well, and
how does that allocate?
First,
well, that's what
pretty much, yeah.
I'm just trying to get my head around.
Yeah.
Multiple carriers and limited infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, and keep in mind every network's different, right? And so each of the engineers for each network will review what their needs are, and then from there, then they'll put together a plan, and then we'll submit. And then if poles are already allocated, then we have to go to plan B.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question for Mr. Rusco.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a glare here. Sorry.
Yeah, that's actually my head.
Yeah.
So I do have a question. Could you tell the council how this signal travels through what we might view as, or if it travels through what we might view as an obstruction? So let's say a tree or a tall home or a power pole that's taller than the antenna. How does that work? What's the technology there? Is it refracted? Does it go through it? What is it?
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Council President Page. So yeah, so depending on the frequency, so in regards to like a 4G frequency, which is anywhere between 600 and 800 megahertz, it propagates differently than the higher frequencies and that's really what 5G is. Like, I don't want to get into a huge lesson on 5G, but essentially 5G isn't, it's not a small wireless facility. It's not like a specific way of doing it. It's just a frequency. And so 5G frequencies the frequencies as it moves further up, that's where you get, that's what we call 5G. It's just the next generation of wireless technology. So for small cells, especially for the depending on if it's a 5G spectrum, it won't go as far. That's why we need more of these small cells in an area or location. And yeah, they are obstructed, like they don't penetrate buildings, and it really is hard with trees. And so we try to look for open areas. If it's a 4G small cell, it does a little bit better. It will go through the trees and through into buildings, things like that, because it'll pick up that whatever that device is, right? So if it's 4G, it'll pick up that frequency. If it's a 5G spectrum or frequency, it's harder because it's to move. It's harder to pass through objects.
So that means you need more of them then?
Depending on geography, topography, garden cities, where there's lots of trees. So it just depends.
Does it travel as far if it's an open space?
Ask me that again.
So if I'm in an open space,
mm-hmm.
there's no obstructions. Does it travel further than 4G? So
no, it won't travel further than 4G. The spectrum that 4G uses, it does propagate further. Think of it kind of like as a wave. Mm-hmm. So 4G waves will kind of like, there's these big rolling waves. 5G, they're shorter, which carries more data, which is really when we get into smart city applications, Internet of Things. That's really, it's the amount of data that's being carried from point A to point B. That's really what's needed. And so that's why we use a higher frequency with the smaller cells. And so, so the 5G spectrum doesn't go as far as a 4G spectrum. So if it's in open space, so of course we'd rather have it in open space, and that's why it's important to be in the right of way as well, because that is where a bulk of not only the existing poles are, but then also it creates opportunities for it to get to where it needs to get to. Did I answer your question, President?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we can have a work session on May 9th if you want to get this done. Or
just a process issue, Mr. Mayor. How does that work for a public hearing? Like, how do you get? I mean, I would think residential neighborhoods would want.
We just notice it up. They've got 2 weeks to. We'll get a notice out, put it on Facebook, and
is that something we can post on our website?
At some point we've got to deal with this because somebody's going to file an application and start our shot clock. So if we want to get ahead of it, we better get with the program. If not, we're going to be.
Because of the preemptive nature of this, I assume the public hearing would be for nothing more than design.
Yes. Yes. Get
really,
input, and
I think potentially a brief process. Correct.
Yes, I think we'd get input on. We just disseminate the information on height, and we've got whether there's 4 or 6 designs that. I can't remember. I thought we talked about there are some designs that Verizon and AT&T, if I remember right. If I don't, somebody can correct me, that they could use the same design. So you've got to have a design that's compatible with the different carriers, at least some of them.
And I do have a legal question as a follow-up for Mr. Wadhams. I think I read this somewhere in LUPA, Mr. Wadhams, but we are not able to delegate decisions at this level to a board, entire delegation, right? That's prohibited by under LUPA.
Council President, that's generally true. You can like parking studies. The council, of course, can rely on parking studies, what other boards or bodies might think about designs, but ultimately the decision is yours. You can't delegate that decision to some other entity or body. So the buck stops here, so to say.
I mean, I just think that technical details really are best left for technicians.
Yeah. Well, Council President Page, that's a point well taken. And one of the concerns from the planning department, development services, is, how's a planner reviewing this going to know all the technical aspects of it? So I'm trying to make it more of a simple process that the planner can just look at a picture and say, well, if it looks like the picture, it's good. But I don't think it's quite that simple, but we are trying to simplify it because it is very technical.
Mr. Mayor, just one question, if I may. So do I understand that this council wouldn't be approving design by design by design in the context of neighborhood or street or any of that, but can defer to development services or staff? So we'd be approving what, a range of designs, or the designs that Mr. Wadhams has provided us. I mean, I can't imagine our picking a particular kind of street lamp or vehicle for attaching this equipment that suits all cases, all needs. That's something we can defer, can't we?
Well, Mr. Mayor, if I may, I think I have an answer for that. And so Councilmember Heller, yeah, what the request is for the council to say, these are the design standards.
Yeah.
This is what's acceptable. There's also a clause that's built in here that they can ask for basically a waiver or a variance if they have a good reason. But then it's a staff decision. It's not the city council that's deciding. The city council is saying these are the standards, and then and then the staff looks at the standards, and then they say whether it meets the standards or not. So these individual applications, and that's one of the problems with the shot clock is if it was a cup, it would go to either planning and zoning or city council, and I just don't think with the shot clock we have time for that. So what the proposal is, Councilmember Heller, is that this will be a staff level decision. The council says what the standards are, and then leave it to the staff to interpret that.
What's the need for another work session then?
Well, there isn't one if you're willing to approve what's been presented in the staff report.
Yeah,
we're done. But if you want to, when you're dealing with preemption, it really challenges us with the public process. The real public process went through the process when it was preempted, and that was far above our level of authority. So the location, someone could come in and say, I like the historic look, and that might be appropriate on some parts of town. Your mayor's preference is, gee, anywhere we can replace one of our aging street lights with one of these and attach our light to their facility, that's in the city's best interest. And some places, some neighborhoods, depending on the spacing of the street lights, we might not end up with more stuff, or we might. Who knows? But if you're prepared to make a decision based on the staff report, fine. If there's deference, particularly to the new council members, that you want to take a harder look at this, then you can act on what's before you. your choice.
Seeing this for the first time, I maybe want to look at it a little bit closer, but I guess, do we feel that the residents of Garden City have had a big enough opportunity to see this and speak out and know what the designs are, or did they have that opportunity through public hearing?
It's been on our agenda, I don't know how many times. There are those that may not respond until one of these is being installed. That's kind of how that works, but it's just a preference. If you want to, we can notice it up and give people that want to come an opportunity to express an opinion. I think we need to narrowly focus what opinions we're requesting them to chime in on, because those that have real safety concerns, I've heard of from them personally. I get approached when I'm at public meetings sometimes. Last time down at the courthouse. But my response is that's not a decision the city council can make. And the tactic to prevent them from coming in is something that I don't think we have the latitude to really address. And I don't want to invite an application to trigger the shot clock prematurely. So I'd like the council to make their mind up. And I think the challenge we have is that we have 2 new council members that have come in fairly late in this process, and getting you to a level where you're comfortable with the design side of this.
And is the design side Exhibit A? Is that?
It is. That's what Councilmember Jacobs, that's currently where it's at. If you were to ask me to give a recommendation on this one, I'm going to recommend that we continue this until May 9th, give the public another opportunity to chime in. Let me tweak a couple things, and then they give you another couple weeks to kind of digest it all. So that would be my recommendation.
Does that affect the shot clock though?
No, we have no pending applications. The industry's been really patient with us, but if they wanted to play hardball, they could start submitting applications, and we'd have to deal with the shot clock. But they have been great to work with. They've been very patient, but I think they deserve some answers in the near future.
We get 2 weeks, Jason.
Since he lives in Meridian, we can probably get him back here if we need him, maybe. So, okay. I would recommend that somebody make a motion to defer this item to May 9th as the date certain. And we'll just address it right in the council meeting.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I would so move.
Got a motion to defer resolution 1122-22 to a date certain of May 9th. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, got a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, clerk call roll.
Councilmember Jacobs?
Yes.
Councilmember Jorgensen?
Yes.
Councilmember Page?
Yes.
Councilmember Heller?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. Next item G4. This is a public hearing on ordinance.
It's the text.
1025-22. This is amending language for our code amendments for flood hazard ordinance. So Jenna, sorry, I was looking at 2 things about went cross-eyed.
Mayor, members of the council, thank you. And thank you for introducing this item, Mayor. Just for your convenience, this item starts on 312 of your packet. The first 5 pages are the Planning and Zoning Commission as well as the Design Review Committee's recommendations. What this proposed ordinance, let me back up a little bit of a history. In 2020, Garden City adopted the state's model floodplain ordinance. And then this spring, the city received a 5-year audit by the FEMA insurance branch that comes and reviews the city every 5 years to make sure and to rate the city, give the city a classification for flood insurance purposes. During that audit, the insurance branch or the community rating system branch indicated that they felt that there were a couple of areas that our code was deficient in, and where it was deficient is the freeboard or the area between the base flood elevation and the first finished floor cannot be interpretable. And they felt that we had two sections where there was some room for interpretation, and that was in the mechanical as well as the manufactured mobile home section. And so the individual that audited the city's code or the city system, including the city's code, had made some recommendations on how to tighten that up to make it very clear that the city requires 2 foot of freeboard. And then there's a third change that's been noted by staff, where FEMA's requirements for substantial changes are different than when you have minor alterations. And so the FEMA guidance allows for communities, when there's a minor alteration to a structure that was built legally. So as long as it's not, the addition's not intended to be below base flood elevation, it can meet the standard to which it was, the structure was originally constructed. I believe that that's the intent of the current Garden City Code, but it's not quite what it says. If you look through the existing code, basically it says you have to be built prior to 1980, even though there's been a number of changes in the flood insurance rate maps since then. And following FEMA guidance does allow that minor alterations can be made to legally constructed structures to the standards under which they were built. The code amendment does propose to allow for that leniency. A great example might be if you're building an addition for a mother-in-law bedroom. Right now, you might have to build it 3 feet above the rest of the house, and this would allow for that minor alteration to meet the rest of the house's elevations. And with that, I stand for questions.
Questions? Basically, we're complying with the audit from you for flood insurance. Okay, thank you, Jenna. With that, I'll open the public hearing on ordinance 1025. Oh, Jenna, one other thing before you leave. If the council chooses to act on this tonight, do we need to suspend and adopt to get it on the books, or can it go through the 3 reading?
Mayor, thank you for that question. It can go through the 3 readings.
Okay. Open the public hearing now on ordinance 1025-22. And is anyone signed up? No one present has signed up to testify. Is there anyone online? Let the record reflect that no one that has joined us online has raised their hand to testify. With that, I will close the public hearing on ordinance 1025-22 and turn it to the council. The motion, if you choose to make a motion, would be to request that the clerk read ordinance 1025-22 by title only for the first reading.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
I move that we have the clerk read public ordinance 1025-22 by title only for the first reading.
Second. I got a motion and a second. Is there discussion?
Mr. Mayor, don't we need a motion to adopt the ordinance?
No, we're just going to read it tonight, and then we'll read it for the next 2 meetings, and then on the third read. No, it's okay.
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 Perfect.
Life's a dance, we learn as we go. Okay, I've got a motion and a second for first reading. Is there any further discussion? Hearing now, the clerk call roll.
Councilmember Jorgensen.
Yes.
Councilmember Page.
Yes.
Councilmember Heller.
Yes.
Councilmember Jacobs. Ordinance 1025-22, an ordinance of the City of Garden City, a municipal corporation of the state of Idaho, amending Garden City Code Title 8 Development Code, Chapter 4H Flood Hazard, Section 5 Provisions for Flood Hazard Reduction by amending the language to include updated standards for flood protection, providing severability, repealing conflicting city code provisions, approving a summary of the ordinance, and providing an effective date.
Great, thank you. There's no unfinished business. No new business. I don't think we have any updates for executive tonight.
It could wait another 2 weeks.
Okay. So we're waiting on the highway district, everyone, to respond to what the council approved at our last meeting. So with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn, after which we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll reconvene the work session.
I move we adjourn, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
I would second. Oh.
Okay. Motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Great. Thank you. We stand adjourned. We'll reconvene in 5 minutes and we'll reconvene the work session. Thank you. It's 7:34. We're reconvening the work session with Hannah Ball and Jason Jones on the topic of tiny homes on wheels proposal that they have. As we continue, before I had a brief sidebar with Jason, and there were some areas that had come up that needed some attention. And Jason, if you would, so we kind of move this along, would you just go through those areas that you were referencing when you talked to me before the meeting and take us through that? And then maybe we can pick some questions up if that's all right with you.
Sure.
To get us going.
I think, one of the things we're working on pretty hard and staff is really kind of leading the way because we kind of submitted codes. We got a staff report back. And so it's really about getting a definition of a tiny home so that when you approve a tiny home community, it doesn't just look like a trailer park, or it doesn't look like an RV park, or it doesn't look like all the other things that are already allowed. Because I know in theory, like I said, you could have a bunch of tiny homes that are RVs and they could just you could end up with something that looks like an RV park. And so we're really taking the chance to define tiny homes so that what we get is actually what everybody thinks of as tiny homes. So like if you go watch all these little TV shows on tiny homes, like Tiny Home Nation, the things on there are all what we call tiny homes. So the real key is getting some language so that is what we get. So, I think in my mind, it's making sure we're really inclusive of everything that's a tiny home, because the reason tiny homes are classified as RVs isn't because they're actually RVs. It's because the tiny home builders know that right now, because places haven't caught up to the zoning, and there is no tiny home zoning, there's no tiny home community in most zoning codes, that the reason that they're classified as RVs is because that's a route to legality. So like I said, in the city of Moscow, it's a route to legality. But the real reality is that tiny homes far exceed those building standards of RVs. Like I said, the tiny home I'm building has got 2x4 construction. It would meet all the standards of actually commercial construction standards. And so I think most of the time, if you actually go look at a tiny house, you realize that it's going to actually far exceed like RV standards because of that type of construction. And so I think we can capture that in this code to make sure that what we get is, even though it might be classified as an RV, the thing we're allowing in a tiny house community isn't just an RV. So I think that's kind of what we were discussing before. And I do think that's important because the code already allows for RV parks. That's not something we're trying to fix, but what we're trying to address is the fact that this is something different and something maybe more appealing.
So we did add a definition specifically to the definition of a tiny house. So possibly look at those sections of code and see what your thoughts are. And again, we don't need to do it. Again, this is really to see what other items you might have. So
Yeah,
that definition, the licensing.
And I would say we've actually, even since the last submittal, so we've had, this is the second code submittal. So obviously we've already had a couple of hearings with the other committees.
Sure.
And so those work sessions, we've already made changes to what that definition looks like, because we had a staff report that kind of had some recommendations already to how those changes should look. So we'll, you know, it's not even necessary that you look specifically at that right this minute, but I think that's going to be a big part of how you approve this going forward, is that we want to have a definition that kind of encompasses what's going to be allowed, what you are familiar with, and then what you're comfortable approving, so that you know you get a tiny home community.
So one thing I would recommend, if you haven't seen one of these, get a hold of Jason and go look at one, because Teresa and I had an opportunity to go look at one, and that it will answer any construction related question you might have. Wiring's all in conduit, look like a commercial building inside, heavy framed chassis. You can actually get R values in the walls and ceiling. And they're under one I looked at, under 2 heavy duty, or is it 3? It's a 2 axle yours?
Yeah,
2 heavy duty axles, and you know, and so it's, that part is easy to deal with. And I don't want to presume on you, but I'm presuming you would entertain if somebody wants to see that. So I think the construction component is easy to answer. The issue of they've got to have a legal designation to answer, and that's a procedural thing that is not part of this. To jump to the park itself, we talked about smaller pads than in a mobile home park, and some, I don't know if it's a ratio of open space or how to address that, but there's going to be some component on that front. Let's talk about the rationale for very limited parking.
Sure. So our current proposal is 1, correct?
Well, we've got kind of a dual, I would say. So in the R3, where mobile home parks are currently allowed, we've just got it 1-to-1. And I think the rationale for that is that a tiny house might only take up 220 square feet, in a parking space, if you have back out space included, might be 400 square feet. So to have like 800 square feet dedicated to cars maybe doesn't make sense for somebody who's trying to live a simpler life. In the C2 zone, we have even a smaller parking requirement. And I think, you know, our rationale is that we think that those units in those commercial areas are going to be more like live work type units. And I think the idea is that we're really trying to appeal to people who are trying to simplify their lives. And it's not that you can't have the parking. We're just going to say that if you didn't want to have the parking, we're not requiring it. But again, that's something we're flexible to work with. It really comes down to what you believe. But I do think where a tiny home is allowed to be next door to a business, you might have people who are working in tiny homes at the brewery and they can just walk next door.
Okay, I read in the packet that you'd even thought about tiered space rental, depending on whether someone was going to have a car or not. Where I'm going with this, just to, if I can get it articulated, I think there's a concern that how do you control how many cars are associated with the tiny home development?
Sure.
And parking, there are a lot of perspectives on parking. It takes up a lot of land. It could be more utilized better for something else and all those things. And then I get The latest one I have is from the Stagecoach because there isn't enough parking on 32nd Street that people going to the breweries park in the Stagecoach parking lot, and then the Stagecoach customers are complaining or parking somewhere. So we get all of that comes in,
Sure.
you know. So what I read into this, I wanted you to clarify. If you have an internal way to control the parking, so if you have a 25 unit tiny home on wheels project, and you have, I'm making numbers up now, you have 10 parking spaces. So 15 of the people that you lease a space to wouldn't have an automobile. And that would be something that the ownership would, is that what you're saying, would control? I'm trying to just kind of see how we.
I think that is what we're kind of saying, not necessarily, but
Okay.
at a minimum. So that's the minimum requirement. I mean, obviously, anybody who's designing a tiny home community can design it how they want. If
No,
they
I
want more. I don't think there's a restriction. I think right now, city code has minimums for parking. And so in our mind, you know, we kind of, you know, we've been in the city of Boise meetings, which has kind of, I think, biased some of our thoughts. And city of Boise's claim is that people at the lower end of the income spectrum, there's a much higher percentage of those people that don't own cars.
Right.
So it's kind of an interesting thing. In other words, whereas I think like the average person, number of cars that people own is like 1.7 cars per person or something like that in the valley. When you go down to the bottom of the income spectrum, there's like 30% of people who don't own cars.
So since they're movable, and you've mentioned that you can move them every couple of weeks, wouldn't the assumption be that if you own a teeny home, you have a vehicle to move it with?
I think that's mostly not the case.
Then how is it? So I guess then they aren't movable. Then people aren't moving them every few weeks.
Oh, no. The tiny homes themselves are much harder to move, I think. So what I kind of tell people is they're really not built to be moved. I mean, they're on wheels and they can be moved easily, but.
Well, they're easier than a mobile home for certain.
Well, I mean, because you mentioned well, we could see, you know, people coming in every 2 weeks and things like that. But then now you're saying, well, no, those people don't really own cars. So
the easiest, what we found in research was the easiest and quickest way to, if you didn't own a F-250 or larger, which a lot of people don't,
it's a big rig.
Is U-Haul.
Yeah. Well, I think one, we don't want people coming in and out every 2 weeks. So I want to make it clear. I think we want to actually build communities.
So kind of like, well, Weezer's done it, but they've done it with the foundation. They require foundation.
Well, we've got an issue with, and you brought it up earlier, and I don't know what the right answer is, but we've got an issue with RV parks are designed for people driving through the area, and they want to visit somebody in there, or it's a touristy thing, and they want to camp across the street here for a month or whatever the time limit is there. As I go through this material, you have a vision for people to have a place to stay where they don't have to relocate every 90 days. And so kind of slaying that component is what I'm perceiving as one of the challenges that we're trying to navigate in segregating a tiny home community from an RV community, so that you have, you know, I don't know that it might be something that we have to take to the legislature. I do that stuff too, if we have some provision. It makes no sense to me to have someone who wants to permanently live, if this were to get across the finish line, and make them pull their unit out for 2 weeks and then come back, because that's what you could do.
Yeah. So that is kind of like what Ada County does here. So every 6 months.
Yeah, you have to
move your
unit out.
Every district is different about those timelines.
So the timelines are based on what the city wants.
Yes. Yes.
And so that's a perception I had, is that if you had a teeny home, you could tell you probably had a rig to do it. That's not the case.
I would say that, so the truth is, like, we had a small, like 20-foot tiny home on display, but it was 14,000 pounds.
Oh, so they're heavy.
So you need a 2-ton to haul it, which not everybody has a 2-ton truck.
You have
But
to
like I said,
hire them to move.
Right.
I think the more likely response about why they're easier to move is that a lot of people know somebody who knows somebody who has a 2-ton truck. Yeah.
But I wanted to talk about the parking thing because that comes
Yeah.
up, and I've had a discussion. Jen and I were I bring things up with no.
Well, and I think that is
warning.
important. I mean, I think it's important that we get your input
important.
on what your
Yeah,
thoughts are to that
it's,
end.
if there's going to be a parking enforcement component associated with having more units than vehicles, because we are trained
Yeah.
and experience tells us that the converse is many times, not all the time, but many times true, is we end up with more cars than we anticipated
Absolutely.
in some areas. And then we create a parking standard that may not fit, which we've all seen those kinds of things. So if we have a parking standard that is atypical, then how do we control, if we're wrong, the bleed off into the surrounding neighborhood, which is something that I hear in my office as we're approving and doing some, done some parking waivers. That sort
I
of thing.
think that's a lot of complaints. I know
So if
waterfront.
you're the owner of one of these parks, there'd have to be a mechanism. And this is just off the top of my head. There ought to be a mechanism on how the landlord is responsible for regulating the number of cars associated with that particular development. Because if the business model is 70% of the people are going to own automobiles or fit whatever the percentage you want to use, and the rest aren't, then that's going to create some kind of a ratio per unit, which you had in an earlier vision of a half space per unit. If I'm remembering that wrong.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that was effective.
So then the city's in a situation that as the administrator, I don't want to get in if I can avoid it. And that's regulating something that I think if it's a condition of approval, that ought to be regulated by the landowner, which has these. So it might be something for you to think about how we might deal with that if you're going to make a request for a half car space per unit. How's that going to get enforced?
Sure.
So you don't have to give me an answer. I'm just saying.
Well,
that's
I can at least tell you kind of how the discussions around that went, because we did have some right at the very beginning with design review. And I think, we kind of proposed that, like, as a landowner, we could separate, because there's a half unit of parking per unit. It basically means like some units wouldn't have parking.
Right.
And I think the idea in our mind is that should be a viable option, because, while that is atypical, people who want to live in tiny homes are also atypical people.
Sure.
That's why I don't think it's like a fix-all solution for affordability, because there are lots of people who even probably wouldn't do it even if it was affordable, because it is
lifestyle.
It is also a lifestyle. And I think what you'll find is that type of person that wants to minimize their life, they're often the people who are like riding their bicycle in the wintertime down the grain belt too. Okay. It's kind of an interesting correlation between those two.
And I think looking at the amenities, because that's something that I really focus on carefully, is when we're promoting those lifestyle trade-offs, we want to make sure, every community has bicycle service station, enclosed lit bicycle areas that are, where it's a lifestyle that isn't just, oh, well, people are going to ride their bikes. Well, are they going to be able to maintain their bikes, secure their bikes, work on their bikes, service their bikes? It's all these bike components that attract the bike enthusiasts to these communities that ultimately we do want to see within the city.
Well, and I think as part of the design review, some of the idea with the parking was even to separate the parking cost from the cost of the space, which again kind of allows, when you kind of look at the way the sites could be designed, I feel like to add parking spaces would be very easy, because it's all open space. Your entire site is really just spaces to park things.
Sure, and you had a price differential.
Yes.
In one of the responses I read.
Yeah,
Lisa,
and I think that's one way that you can separate this idea. That way the people who do need parking, they pay more. And so it, like I said, and then there's actually a benefit to the park owner to have the right amount of parking, because he's going to get more money if he has the right amount of parking. Like I said, to in some way let the free market kind of put the right amount of parking in, instead of having some random minimum that's arbitrary and maybe not representative of the people that are actually living there.
And I also like the idea of actually taking parking and moving it to the central, so that the pathways that go to the homes is really natural by design. And again, has that more pathway, that it's not your traditional, you know, unit parking, because that really promotes this, there isn't as many community spaces. So we're trying to really get away from that traditional trailer park design and get to something that's very natural and very organic by design.
Teresa?
Yeah, Ms. Ball, you said that you focus on the amenities, and on one of your slides you reference look to multifamily for amenities. Can you explain what that means?
I look at our multifamily code, and for developments over 40 units, and don't quote me, whatever large units, developers need to pick 3 amenities. I've always actually liked that section of our code, because there's some flexibility. Developers can go in, and I have seen that when the multifamily developments occur and they have to pick one, bicycle is often selected. Public art is generally also selected, but I think that bicycle service is just like the right thing to have in every development. So I'm just applying our multifamily code, which I actually think is quality.
Do you consider it teeny house on wheels multifamily?
I don't. I just applied our Garden City's multifamily section of code that speaks to amenities.
And then how do you, so one of the questions I had, you've talked a lot about workforce housing, right? In our area, that's kind of leads to parking, because if you is workforce housing, you gotta get to work. In Seattle and Portland, that's great because they have great transportation systems.
Sure.
We don't, right? So I think that kind of that's a thing on the parking too, because if it's workforce, they got to get to work. Unless they live in Garden City, they're going to be driving.
Sure.
And then how do you define workforce housing? What's your definition of that?
That's a great feedback there. So I know Garden City's code has a section that actually defines affordable at 80% AMI. I would say it's fair to say our workforce is in that spectrum, even though that's not government subsidy housing. But I would say if you're working at a brewery, we know the number now is what, $20. The kids working at the breweries making $20 can afford 0 housing in Ada County.
Right. So like Boise did their study on workforce housing, and it was 80% of AMI, but it was also 3-person occupancy. So they consider if it wasn't workforce housing unless it had could house 3 people. And I would find it difficult. And I've been in your TV, it's nice, but you aren't going to have 3 people live inside that thing.
No.
And so, so that's why I question workforce housing really is family housing. And so I don't know if that might be the right definition. It's more for singles or couples that.
Well, and I agree. I love the idea that it's home ownership. And so it's, if you think about what somebody even working at a brewery can afford for purchase at even the most luxurious tiny house at $100,000, I mean, it's a life-changing situation where they can actually save money.
Well, and to hit to your point, I mean, I guess as we think about this, we kind of think like, you know, I go down the street to Western Collective all the time. And when I look at to me, they're like kids, but they're probably 20, 22 or 23. But the kids working there, they're mostly single people. And I guess in my mind, it just makes sense to have an option for them. Like those guys, instead, they're probably living in an apartment with a roommate. And this would be just another option to get them out of that if they wanted to.
So it's kind of that intent, that single.
Yeah, and I think now, not that families that are larger don't live in some larger tiny homes, right, that are designed to have that. But I do think that there's a certain person that this appeals to. And I think it is in our mind, it's really more of those young kids coming out of college, they're getting a job at the brewery. And I think that's kind of a little bit our hope about why we did the parking the way we did, because one of the zones that we want to do this in is the C2 zone. And that's the zone where the RV parks are already allowed. And we kind of see the potential of going, hey, I mean, if this is right next to Western Collective and you got a kid, doesn't have a car, he can just walk next door. Should he have to pay for the fact that there's all these extra car spaces that he's not using?
No, so would you say that you can just keep everything about the RV code the same except for extend the length of stay?
I don't think so. Actually, from my analysis, that's a code that's pretty unattractive if you actually apply it to a design standard.
So since you brought that up, do you have a jurisdiction that you can reference and say, we like that code and adopt it? Because we're all trying to wrap our minds around your vision, and how that vision could be implemented would be much easier to do if we had a code that's, hey, this is what we like, this is what we'd recommend.
So we actually sketched this section of code. So this code we've actually designed as a model. And what I really do get excited about is the open space, and that in looking at it by just practicing sketches, this was a site that really felt quality in nature. And then we actually backed into sections of code saying, you need this much open space, you need this density, you need these amenities to follow. So we haven't really on the scale, even though Blaine County and some of these other counties are saying, yes, let's let this happen. We haven't seen this design theory come in as far as the communities yet. And that's
so you don't have another jurisdiction that you could say, reference this code.
Well, and so to get to the RV, I mean, what we did with the code, so the code that you see submitted in that second submission, we actually put our code side by side with the RV code. So we actually went back, edited it, and kind of rewrote it to match the RV code. And I think you'll see that I think part of it is that we don't believe the city wants to just allow RV parks everywhere. That's the real truth of what we think. We're not sure that you want an RV park next to Western Collective. Right. Whereas we do think that Western Collective probably wouldn't mind if there was a tiny home community of 4 little tiny homes across the street where their employees could live, right? So I think that's the first, but again, we don't know because we haven't heard from you. But if you said, hey, we actually do want RV parks everywhere in Garden City that's commercially zoned, then the RV code could be fixed too. But I think what we've created is something that we think is more palatable than the RV code. And like I said, we do have a straight comparison between the two that are in that document.
So here's kind of the challenge is, like, if you want, I think, to remove the challenge of comparing a tiny house community to an RV park, then let's find a code that you can reference that's based on a tiny house community.
Sure, and there are some nationally.
Yeah.
Find a jurisdiction. It doesn't need to be in Idaho. Right?
Yeah.
We can always say what here applies to, or we need to take exception to.
And I think in my mind, that may be a more complicated thing, because again, part of our goal is to make the code that we're writing fit with how Garden City's code is written, so that it meets the local land use planning act, so that it actually covers, because not every state has a local land use planning act. Not every city even has that. And so by copying the RV code and starting as a point, we're making sure that we're at least meeting those standards, and really maybe finding some issues with even those standards that can get cleaned up, so that what we get is something that's actually legal here in Idaho.
Well, and I think sets the bar very high for tiny house communities. And that's, we've looked at least 50 communities, and I feel that there's still these amenities are huge. And I just haven't, it's not to say I haven't seen the amenities I'd like. I would just like a variety of amenities. And I guess, it's interesting because the tiny house codes have now been analyzed on the individual level. I think this is the first time that we're really analyzing them from the development lens of what are the quality of life amenities that go into communities that make them very successful. And so we're looking at that from traditional development lens and saying, we know we can design these communities that are amazing, that are the highest standard of tiny house communities. They're not just like, well, put them wherever. And so we've seen a lot of communities, but I'm still really excited that this is going to set the bar for the amenities.
Yeah, I mean, I think to get to the bottom of it, I mean, most of the cities that are legalizing them, they're really doing it as like, so Moscow is saying, hey, you just apply for an RV park and we took the time limit off of RVs and now you're good. And that's great. I mean, it's one solution, but it allows people to have tiny homes, and it's kind of an emergency quick fix. And we could do that. We could just be like, hey, we already have the RV thing. We'll just fix a few things in that and then allow it. But I think we're also saying, look, if we make this great, and then when people see something that they go, oh, that's kind of cool, then all of a sudden it's more likely to be duplicated.
So it's more like a mobile home park where you rent the space, the pad, right? I mean, really,
it could be.
It's a mobile home park, but it's a mobile home.
Yeah, it could be. I think what we're really aiming for is to make sure, you know, there's a stigma to a mobile home park, right? And I think the goal here is to, you know, one, by limiting the density, you kind of force a lot more open space so that it can feel a little more clean.
How do you, since you don't own the teeny home like a mobile home park, how do you enforce maintenance, dilapidation, all those things that come with?
And that's where I think that element of it, the responsibility goes back onto the park owners, which will have a mechanism for citation from the city side to say, hey, if there is anything that the park owner isn't doing, that citation falls directly onto the park owner.
And I do think, I mean, so like right now, a great example is the RV parks that exist. They kind of self do that, even though they're not required to by law. So lots, you know, one of the big complaints with people who are trying to find spaces for their RVs is that RV parks won't take them. So if you have an old RV,
fifth wheel,
you can't actually get into an RV park right now because there's a certain cutoff in time. If it doesn't look like it's a stable living, then the park owners are actually not allowing them. And so I do think that that's kind of already kind of self-determining, at least in the emergency that we're in, where RV parks are completely full. You know, basically the owners right now are getting to pick and choose. You know, now I don't know whether it'll be that way forever, but it seems as of right now that that's for the
they're
foreseeable
certainly
future.
in the driver's seat. I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. I really appreciate you spending and waiting on us to re-engage here. This is a legislative matter. Council, you're free to have interaction on this matter with the applicants. Once it gets into the process, it'll go through the, you know, the normal hearing process, and it'll get back in front of us at some point. But I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up for tonight. And I've learned some things, had some questions answered, and you've hopefully gotten some feedback. And if further questions arise, there's nothing to prevent you from shooting them a note. Don't discuss it among yourselves, but shoot them a note, and I'm sure they'll respond. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
We will adjourn the work session and call it a night.